Hello and welcome to today's lesson where we're looking at the equity theory of motivation. Everyone in the workplace is motivated by something. Now this motivation could be external, such as money or status, or it could be internal, such as a desire to do a good job. Leaders and managers have sought to understand theories of motivation and then test them in the workplace to increase the productivity and the effectiveness of their workforce. Now, Adams' equity theory, which is also known as the equity theory of motivation, was developed in 1963 by John Stacey Adams, a workplace behavioral psychologist. Equity theory is based on the idea that individuals are motivated by fairness. In simple terms, equity theory states that if an individual identifies an inequity between themselves and one of their peers, then they will adjust the work they do to make the situation fair in their eyes. Now, as an example, if an employee learns that a peer doing basically the same job as them is earning more money, then they're going to choose to do less work, thus creating fairness in their eyes. Now, extrapolating from this, Adams' equity theory tells us that the higher an individual's perception of equity, in other words, fairness, the higher their perception of fairness, then the more motivated they will be. So conversely, an individual will be demotivated if they perceive unfairness. To understand Adams' equity theory in full, we need to first define inputs and outputs. Now, inputs are defined as those things that an individual does in order to receive an output. They're basically the contribution an individual makes to the organization. So common inputs might be number of hours work, the commitment shown, the experience brought to the role, personal sacrifices that are made, the loyalty the individual has demonstrated to superiors or the organization, and the flexibility shown by the individual, for example, accepting assignments at very short notice or with tight deadlines. Now, outputs are the result an individual receives as a result of their inputs. Now, some of these are going to be tangible, such as a salary, but others are going to be intangible, such as recognition. So some common outputs are obviously salary, bonus, pension contributions, annual holiday allowances, company cars, stock options, promotion, flexibility of work arrangements, even things like learning opportunity and the sense of achievement the employee has. So now that we understand inputs and outputs, we're in a position to define equity. Equity is defined as an individual's outputs divided by that same person's inputs. And what Adams' equity theory does is it goes a step further and states that individuals don't just understand equity in isolation, but instead they look around and they compare themselves against others. Now, if they perceive inequity, then they're going to adjust their inputs in order to restore balance. And you can see that in the diagram here. You can visualize equity theory by thinking about a weighing scales where you have inputs on one side and outputs on the other, and an individual is always working to keep these two in balance using other people as their reference group. So essentially, individuals will always adjust their inputs because that's all they have control over, so the equation is always in balance. If an individual believes their outputs are lower than their inputs relative to others around them, then they're going to become demotivated. And likewise, an individual may need to increase their inputs if their outputs are greater than those doing exactly the same job. So employees compare themselves using something called referent groups, and a referent group is simply a collection of people a person uses for the purposes of comparison. Now, there are 4 types of referent groups. There's self-inside, and that's the individual's experience within their current organization. Self-outside, the individual's experience within other organizations. Others inside, and that's where they compare themselves with others inside the current organization, and others outside, where they compare themselves with others outside of the individual's current organization. So, for example, If a programmer compares what they earn to other programmers within the same organization, then the referent group is going to be others inside. If they were to compare themselves to programmers they know socially, then the referent group is going to be others outside. If they were to compare themselves to what they earned in their previous job, then the referent group is self outside. Now, an interesting point is that Adam's equity theory still holds even when people compare themselves to others doing very different roles and earning very different compensation. So take our example of a programmer again. They might even compare themselves to the CEO of their company who earns maybe 100 times more than they do. So how can that seem fair? Well, the answer is that they will perceive the inputs to be vastly different. So they will see that they might have, a great work-life balance, whereas the CEO is traveling a lot of the time. They may perceive that the CEO has vastly more experience alongside working much longer hours, and that the CEO has to deal with a lot more stress. And in that way, fairness is established in the mind of our programmer. Now, it's also worth remembering that equity theory applies in a very broad sense. Each person will respond to perceived inequality or inequity in their own individual way. Not everyone is going to adjust the inputs in the same way. You can identify equity theory in the workplace by listening to the phrases that people use in conversation. So, for example, Andy earns a lot more than I do, but doesn't do nearly as much work. I get paid a lot less than Andy, but this place would fall apart without me. Did you hear that the new guy earns $500 more and works less hours? How is that fair? So as you can see, in each of these examples, someone is comparing their own compensation and effort against someone else's. Although comparing compensation is the most common way people compare in the workplace, there are other types. So maybe learning opportunities is a common one as well, or opportunities to work from home. So if you're managing a team, then the key points you will need to keep in mind are: people measure the total of all inputs against the total of all outputs. So for example, that could mean that a person with children may accept flexible working hours in return for lower pay. Now, unfortunately, an individual's values will be used when they measure fairness. So two identical employees on paper may see the fairness of their situation very differently. Now, the art of being a good manager is to manage these expectations and influence how the employee feels. Now, although it's understandable that more senior staff earn significantly more, there are limits to this, and excessive pay for senior people can be demotivating. And finally, an employee who believes they are overcompensated may actually increase their effort. Now, to reduce inequity, there's a few things you can do. You can change an individual's inputs or outputs, obviously. You can change the inputs or outputs of others. And you can also work to change the perception of inputs and outputs. So, in summary, high levels of employee motivation can only be achieved when each employee perceives their treatment to be fair relative to others. Employees compare themselves to groups both inside and outside of the organization, and if they perceive unfairness, they will adjust their inputs to compensate. Remember, their inputs is obviously the only thing they have control over. They don't have control over the outputs. So to help create a high-performance team, learn to recognize the phrases employees use when equity theory is in play. So that's it from me. Hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.